Hey, what's up, witches? I'm back today for part 2 of the 3-part video series that I'm in the process of making, all about connections between Norse paganism or just northern tradition and concepts related to Druidry. Because not only am I a Norse or northern pagan, but I also, as I said in the first part of this series, just always someone who's been interested in Celtic mythology and Druidic traditions, so that's definitely something that I'm going back into and studying again now. You know, I kind of researched and studied it in college a little bit, but now I'm going back and kind of re-examining some of these myths and these texts through a pagan lens, and now trying to really get into the depths of what Druidic traditions are and how I can incorporate them into my own personal pagan and witchcraft practice. But along the way, I've just also noticed a lot of similarities between Celtic and Norse or continental, Germanic, and British Isles myths, gods, goddesses, and especially, in my opinion, and again, I just want to preface this video by saying that, you know, I am not a scholar, I am not a historian, I have an English degree, and I did focus a lot on like world myth and folklore in my studies, just because that is something that has always been of interest to me. And so when I'm going into these kind of what I'm calling comparative mythology deep dives, where in part 2 and 3 of this video, I really want to examine some similarities between concepts that I find when learning about the Norse and like northern Germanic gods and goddesses and their traditions, but also among the traditions of the British, Welsh, Irish, and peoples who were, according to, you know, the Roman writers, which sadly is all we have to go on, but according to them, were the ones that featured this Druidic social class. From the Roman accounts, we can kind of gather from the writings of Caesar et al. That the Druids were these learned men of the Teutonic, Gallic, and British and Welsh people, and they may have had some level of interaction and perhaps even training amongst each other. Caesar states in his accounts that apprentices from the continental Europeans and Germanic and Gaulish tribes were often sent to Britannia or the British Isles for training, and so I wonder if perhaps it also worked vice versa. In his account, he stated that they would be sent to the British Isles for training because it was his understanding that the Druidic class and their teachings had originated from that area. And it's true that we do seem to see them mentioned. From my research and my readings, we come across the mention of these Druids the most often in the Irish and Welsh stories and legends. But he also had a lot to say on Druids and a Druidic priest class among the Gauls, and I think Tacitus also alludes to some of what their practices might have been in Germania. But we know that both the Druids and the Norse had this bardic social class. In the Druids, it was the bards among the bards, ovates, and druid classes of training, and the Norse people had the skalds, who were these highly respected keepers of oral histories, stories, songs, and traditions. And that's another big commonality between these peoples, is that really, when it comes to the Irish and Celtic and British traditions, all we really have to go on for pre-Christian ideas is the writings of the Romans, which were probably, you know, at least somewhat biased. And then on the hand of the Norse myths, all we have to go on really are the things that were passed down slowly through time, through oral tradition and these songs and stories and poems, and were eventually copied down in some way, shape, or another by Snorri Sturluson, the Christian monk. So both of these peoples largely remain shrouded in mystery in terms of what did they actually practice? What were their core beliefs, practices, and traditions? And so for me, as someone who is interested in the myths and practices from this chunk of the world, and seeing that they have a lot of these commonalities, if you will, these common myths, common little kernels of beliefs and traditions among all these northern peoples and the people of the British Isles, it just kind of makes me want to examine both in depth to not only find these commonalities, but maybe make these connections to where we can now take those commonalities and develop a new northern pagan tradition. Because whether it's these peoples from the Scandinavian or northern pre-Christian traditions, or the Germanics and the Gauls from the lower continent, or the peoples from the Isles of Britannia, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, there are these huge gaps in our knowledge because they largely had these oral traditions that weren't written down until much, much later. So it's just been of large interest to me, and always has been, to not only study comparative mythology just as an interesting topic to see from all these different disparate cultures and peoples throughout the globe and throughout the ages, where do we find these commonalities and these cores of belief or greater understanding about the world around us, and how can we take that and bring it into our modern age to help redevelop or reestablish our own pagan connections with the world around us. In the book that I have, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, they have a brief chapter on Druidry and Druidic traditions, and in that book it states that according to the Druids, in our present world, which in the Norse myths we would know as Midgard or Middle Earth, good and evil are so exactly balanced that man has the utmost freedom and is able to choose or reject either. And it kind of ties into this dichotomy that you'll run across a lot in some of the beliefs and traditions that so often fall under the label of Celtic, where it's this kind of tripartite system. In the Wiccan traditions, it's the triple goddess, maiden, mother, crone. Later on in my third part of the video, I'm kind of going to go into what I see as some Norse or Celtic tripartite systems that we can kind of glean from the stories and maybe adapt to our own understandings and modern practices. But it kind of ties into this whole as above, so below mentality, and that I think is also still applicable to the kind of Norse cosmology, where we have a world below of an underworld, Helheim, and then the world of our physical world where humans live, which is the middle world, the material world, Midgard, and then there's kind of this upper world, whether it be heaven, Asgard, Valhalla, or in their case, just kind of this higher realm or higher consciousness where it was just a world of pure light, pure goodness, and peace. They essentially believed, according to the Secret Teachings of All Ages, in three worlds. A world above where happiness predominated, a world below where misery predominated, and our world, which is suspended in between. So it literally just kind of hangs in the balance. Each and every day, it is mankind that holds the power in our even smallest everyday actions and decisions and thoughts to kind of shift that balance to happiness or misery in the current world. And that to me also just ties back into my overall big belief in karma in general. And this is also, I think, something you will see echoed in the beliefs of the Celtic peoples and the Druids, which is this belief that I touched on in the first video in the transmigration of the soul, or in reincarnation. You'll see a lot of common principles that I had found that really appealed to me when I was studying Eastern tradition and Hinduism in terms of the cycle of reincarnation and karma, were just kind of two big pieces that I really resonated with. And I think we see those concepts echoed here in Druidic traditions, where the soul can kind of transmigrate from one realm to another and reincarnate, and through this cycle of building up good karma and just really enhancing our wisdom and elevating our consciousness in each lifetime, we can learn more and just purify the soul in a way to reach that higher state of being and be able to just kind of dwell eternally with the gods, if you will. We can see this concept further mirrored in the Norse cosmology of the world tree and the different realms, where we have Valhalla or Asgard being the higher realm, and then Midgard kind of in between, and lower realms such as Helheim, Niflheim, or Niflhel. And they're all connected by this world tree. And the tree, as we know, is a big concept in Druidic tradition. It's just this idea that all of the realms and all of these states of being and all these different dimensions, however you want to think of it, are all connected, as I said, as above, so below, and the connection is that world tree, and that world tree is also kind of mirrored in us. Wait till Heimdall comes down during meditation, chakra healing session, and reveals to you that your body and your chakras are also a rainbow bridge. So I think we are kind of a microcosm echo of the macrocosm in a big way, perhaps more than we even know. And it's all connected by this world tree. So there's just all these connections that you'll start to see between these concepts that I think are very similar between Druidic traditions and the Norse pre-Christian traditions. Furthermore, in the Druidic tradition, and also particularly among the Gauls, there's this concept, and I think also that we see in Tacitus in Germania and the Germanic peoples, of the sacred grove. And from Tacitus we know that, these peoples, the Germanic continental tribes, didn't really have these big, grand, elaborate temples, at least not out of stone like the Romans did. They had these sacred groves where they would worship. And the Gaulish word for these sacred groves was the nemeton. We also see this echoed somewhat if, you've read, the Golden Bough and books like that. But in some Greek traditions, we see these facets of nature and goddesses of the hunt, like Artemis and Diana. They have an aspect called Diana Nemetona, and that is the Diana of the Grove specifically. And we also know from things like Tacitus, and also from, I believe it's the Flatiarba. I have some quotes here that I took from visions of Vanaheim, where they are citing these Norse sagas and Eddas. And also I think we'll see mention of this in Tacitus, where these sacred groves, especially on the mainland, were sometimes used for the keeping of sacred horses. And these horses, it says in Tacitus, were not used for everyday common labor. They got to live in the grove and weren't really ridden every day. Sometimes a priest would come, or the king or the chieftain would come and hitch them up to a special chariot or wagon and take them out so that they could perform special divinations somehow through the horses. But we also know, interestingly enough, that much like his supposed mother, Nerthus, was another goddess worshipped in these sacred groves, Freyr is also related to horses. And not only that, but after him and his father Njord and his sister Freyja became hostages and went to live in Asgard after the Aesir-Vanir War, Freyr was actually appointed the high priest over sacrifices, much as Freyja was appointed high priestess. And this would essentially have been the role of a druid, to preside over these rituals and these sacrifices. So as I said, his mother is also kind of most often ranked among the Vanir goddesses, even though she is only attested to in these writings of Germania and not the Norse. But it's interesting that we can see these connections between her being worshipped in the sacred groves and these animals that are also related to her son Freyr being kept and worshipped in sacred groves. In the Flateyar book, quoted in Visions of Vanaheim, it also says that there happened to be great sacrifices in the honor of Freyr, and that his idol, and we can also see in Tacitus that there was a Nerthus idol that was taken out to be viewed by the people as well. And similarly, there was an idol of Freyr that would be taken out in a chariot or a wagon and carried around to bless the countryside and receive the people's offerings and blessings in return. In this quote, it says that his idol had such a power that the devil spoke through it. And it also says, in another quote from Visions of Vanaheim, that the horse, it appears, was regarded as a favorite animal of Freyr, and at his temple in Trondheim, it is said that there were horses belonging to him. So again, we see this continued theme of Freyr being related to horses, and horses also being a feature of sacred groves, and Freyr himself almost kind of assuming this role among the peoples of Asgard of a druid. And we also do know that Freyr and his family of the Vanir did not originate in Asgard with the other Aesir, but they came from some distant land known only as Vanaheim. So was this a land where perhaps these druidic types of traditions and practices were even more prevalent? And that is why Freyr was given to either assume or continue in this role once he was there. Just saying, just throwing it out there. Like I said, these are all just my own crazy tinfoil hat theories. I'm not a historian. But I just noticed these similarities and these similar threads throughout all of these different stories, and I see patterns, and I just want to point them out to you guys because I think they're interesting. Because I think if we really start looking at a lot of these teachings and a lot of these myths and these stories, we'll see that not only do many cultures contain myths of a world tree, a tree of life like Yggdrasil, or just some type of concept found everywhere from Taoism to Masonic and secret societies of as above, so below, and that is also a large concept from what we can gather of the beliefs of the Druids. And so to me it just all ties together very easily into not only things that I am interested in and learning more about, but as I said, also just incorporating into my own personal beliefs, traditions, and practices in the modern day. These myths, and these even like down to the fairy tales, to me are not just myths and stories. Once you really start examining the teachings and the myths passed down orally and in the written form from these druids and these skalds and these bards, they're also acting as a deeply metaphorical teaching, which was meant to preserve and pass down knowledge, which is kind of hidden in these many deep layers of meaning. So to maybe the everyday common people hearing these stories by the fire whenever the bard would come to town and tell a story about Thor and Odin, or Bran and Branwen, or whoever it may be, maybe it's just a fun story about Thor and Odin as the ferrymen exchanging insults, or whatever it is. But I think even in those more lighthearted, humorous stories, they were meant to deeply entrench hidden concepts, teachings, and lore in hidden layers of metaphor, which those who had the deeper layers of education would know the hidden symbolism of. And something like that, I think, is not only what was passed down through the Druids, but also became kind of highly adapted into things like the modern day Masonic societies in terms of their rituals, elaborate rituals, and even in a lot of the Wiccan high magic, just these things that look like standard everyday rituals using tools and things and saying these chants on the outset, but are deeply layered in hidden meaning. And the more we examine these stories and the gods and goddesses associated with them, to me, the more we can peel back these many layers and learn more about them than perhaps what we can just take away from the surface value of these stories and these folk tales. That's really a large part of what I am trying to do here, especially with these videos, is not just give you a black and white scholarly breakdown of who the Druids were and what they believe, but to me also examine these gods, deities, myths, legends, and sagas associated with these gods and goddesses from these cultures that would have been passed down by these druids, and try to discover, even though I'm not by any means ever going to be saying that I'm right or that any of these things have any scholarly backing. It's just fun concepts that I string together in my brain, and I don't think that, like, Odin and the Dagda, for example, to give you a preview of what part 3 of the video is going to be about, I don't think that they're the same exact being. They're very different once you kind of get into the nitty-gritty and breakdown. But I just, like I said, with Freyr and the Druids and the horses and the sacred groves, there's a lot of these concepts which, if you read the texts or you read into the stories, you'll find a lot of these similar concepts or similar hidden kernels of truth embedded in these stories, which I think can perhaps help us fill in the gaps between one and the other. At least to me, I think it's not only helpful, but also just deeply interesting. I hope that this rambly video was still somewhat informative and interesting to you, and stay tuned for part 3, where I will be going into the concept of Odin as a druidic priest king in some of his different facets and forms that he takes. Hi. So yeah, stay tuned for that. I hope that you found this video interesting, and part 3 will be coming soon. And until then, stay classy, pagans.